ADX Florence is considered the most terrible prison in the world with unbearable living conditions. It's located in the heart of democracy in Florence, Colorado, USA. It has many nicknames, such as Mountain Alcatraz, reflecting its isolation and severity. Today we'll tell you how this prison differs from others in the world and why it carries an especially harsh regime under which its prisoners rarely survive. ADX Florence in Colorado, USA has become one of the strictest and most secure prisons in the world. Its creation was necessitated by the need to combat high-profile criminals deemed particularly dangerous to society. Opened in 1994, it has since housed the most dangerous criminals, such as terrorists, serial killers, and organized crime leaders. The idea for ADX Florence emerged in 1983, following a horrific attack by inmates on staff at the federal prison in Marion, Illinois. Despite extensive security measures, a riot broke out. Shockingly, Marion had replaced Alcatraz, known as the strictest and toughest prison. In the USA, it was long understood that prison security systems needed improvement. In Alcatraz's case, it was believed that the cold waters would prevent prisoners from escaping. However, this didn't deter escapees. In 1962, 3 criminals made a successful escape from the prison, leading to its closure in 1963. Dangerous criminals from Alcatraz were then transferred to other prisons, most to Marion. New security systems were developed in Marion, testing whether individual containment and near-total isolation would enhance prison security. The idea was that criminals couldn't conspire to attack guards or riot. However, these too failed when 2 inmates, part of criminal organization, killed 2 guards in 1983. This incident prompted the creation of an even higher security level, evolving from maximum to supermax. Marion became the first such prison, but the administration soon realized it was impractical to retrofit old buildings for new requirements. Building a new prison was more feasible, leading to the establishment of ADX Florence. The architecture and security systems of the prison were designed to eliminate any possibilities of escape plans or organizing crimes within its walls. ADX Florence's harsh rules mean that only hardened criminals or its staff can enter. Only once have outsiders visited, when journalists were given a 2-hour tour in 2007. ADX Florence left a chilling impression on the reporters. The building was eerily silent. The security level was so high that even a mouse couldn't go unnoticed, with cameras and motion detectors everywhere, surrounded by a massive barbed wire fence. The cell walls inside were soundproof. For ADX Florence staff, this is routine, all designed for their safety, aimed at preventing internal conflicts. It's worth noting that the cells where inmates are held look very neat. Everything is designed so that the criminal, even if they wanted to, couldn't harm themselves. Almost everything inside the small room is made of concrete. The bed is a special podium with smoothed corners, topped with a mattress, blanket and pillow. The table and chair are also concrete with beveled edges. The sink has no protruding faucet, and the toilet has a system that immediately blocks it in case of clogging. The shower has a timer that turns off the water to prevent flooding. Impressive, right? What if we say there's even a window in the cell? Yes, a very large one. Okay, that was a small joke. The window in the cell measures 4 by 47 inches, positioned so that inmates can't orient themselves or know their location. Notably, with good behavior, inmates can earn privileges. Besides food, they might receive literature and even a radio or TV in their cell, though only educational and religious programs are broadcasted. This is a slight ease considering inmates are in complete isolation for 23 out of 24 hours a day, with no communication. The only person they might see is the worker distributing food, who never responds but simply continues their duty. Since we've touched on what the inmates do, it's important to delve deeper into this topic. As mentioned, inmates only have 1 hour per day to communicate with someone. Typically, they are allowed to use the phone to talk to a limited circle of people, including a lawyer. But if an inmate decides to make a phone call, they won't get a walk. Speaking of which, going outside, as you might guess, is not an option for terrorists and particularly dangerous criminals. The walk takes place in a peculiar pool. It's an outdoor area where inmates only see the ceiling, designed so that no one can determine their location. The space is very narrow, allowing only about 10 steps in a straight line and just 31 steps to make a full circle. If a criminal doesn't want to socialize or walk, they can engage in physical exercises or visit the chapel. Interestingly, ADX Florence seems to prioritize the safety of inmates more than ordinary citizens. For example, the food for inmates is always special. Meals are served exclusively in the form of puree or porridge to eliminate any possibility of self-harm. What do inmates do for the remaining 23 hours of the day? They stay in their isolated cells. As you can imagine, this simply drives them insane. No sound, no communication, no activities. In ADX Florence, inmates are almost always left with nothing to do. Hearing about the conditions in this correctional facility, one naturally wonders about the terrible personalities it holds. We've briefly touched on this topic already. Besides terrorists, ADX Florence houses especially dangerous criminals, serial killers, maniacs, and traitors to the USA. For example, Harold Nicholson is incarcerated there. Who is he? A former Central Intelligence Agency agent convicted of espionage for Russia from 1994 to 1996. His sentence, probably one of the lightest among all inmates at ADX Florence, is 23 years of imprisonment. A more severe punishment was given to another spy, Robert Hansen. This former FBI agent was convicted for 15 instances of passing secret state-important documents to Soviet and Russian foreign intelligence agents from 1979 to 2001. And how long do you think he was sentenced to? 15 life terms without the possibility of parole. By the way, he already served one of them, as Robert Hansen died in 2023 at the age of 79. Since humanity hasn't figured out how to resurrect the dead, extending punishment for the traitor is impossible. Which terrorists are in ADX Florence? For instance, Zacarias Moussaoui. This French citizen of Moroccan descent was one of the organizers of the horrific terrorist attacks on September 11, 2001. He was sentenced to 6 life terms. But the record holder is Terry Nichols. Together with his accomplice Timothy McVeigh, he orchestrated the Oklahoma City bombing in 1995, killing 168 people and injuring 680. Timothy McVeigh was sentenced to death, but Terry Nichols was a bit luckier. He was sentenced to, attention, 161 life terms without the possibility of parole. It seems that even after death, this terrorist will not be free. ADX Florence can house a maximum of 490 inmates, but currently it holds only 335 criminals. Most of them were transferred from other prisons due to aggressive behavior, and these inmates have the highest chances of improving their conditions. Another interesting fact about ADX Florence is that the prison has an emergency button, which when pressed, simultaneously locks 1,400 steel doors. It's located in the central monitoring area, staffed 24/7, where employees track everything happening within the prison walls. For additional security, the ADX Florence perimeter is constantly patrolled by dogs. But that's not all. An armed convoy patrols around the prison at all times. And do you think there have been escape attempts under such conditions? Of course not. There's not a single known case of even an attempted escape from ADX Florence. The whole idea of the prison, besides reducing escape attempts and rebellions, was for inmates locked up with themselves to reflect on their misdeeds and reform. However, in reality, confinement in a cell without any contact with outsiders only leads to psychological problems. Scientists note that prolonged isolation in a confined space alone for several hours starts to affect a person's psyche. In ADX Florence, inmates are kept like this for decades. Some claim that such prisons conduct human experiments involving extended solitary confinement. The New York Times recounted the sad and troubling story of ADX Florence inmate Jack Powers. He was jailed for robbery and later sent to this dreadful place for escaping from another prison. Isolation drove Powers to madness. He cut off his earlobes, bit off his finger, and crushed his head to inject his brain with bacteria-saturated liquid. Another inmate, Travis Dusenberry, told the Marshall Project that a terrifying sense of claustrophobia attacks you inside the cell even if you don't typically suffer from this fear. Dusenberry noted that anything changing around him helped him survive. Even the approaching winter and snow seen through the tiny window gave him strength. Travis, transferred to ADX Florence for assaulting a guard in another prison, spent 10 years there. ADX Florence has 6 different security levels. Inmates can move from stricter to less strict regimes and possibly to other prisons. This doesn't apply to extremely dangerous criminals, such as terrorists and those threatening US national security. Even after release from solitary confinement, the effects of isolation linger. In 1993, Dr. Stuart Gracian described a condition known as SHU syndrome, characterized by paranoia, panic attacks, aggression, and psychotic symptoms. This syndrome will haunt inmates for the rest of their lives. The Eighth Amendment to the US Constitution prohibits cruel and unusual punishments. Considering the known psychological effects of solitary confinement, shouldn't prisons like ADX Florence be declared illegal? It seems that such confinement conditions are nothing short of torture. However, the conditions of incarceration comply with all constitutional norms and laws. Attempts have been made repeatedly in court to prove that holding inmates in solitary cells for a certain period is unconstitutional. However, all these attempts have been in vain. No court in America has identified any violations. Yet, international legal communities are increasing pressure to end the practice of prolonged solitary confinement in the US. For instance, the United Nations established the Mandela Rules, regulating the treatment of prisoners. According to these rules, the use of prolonged solitary confinement is prohibited and equated to torture. Confinement longer than 22 hours a day is considered prolonged. However, there have been minor victories in the fight for inmates' rights at ADX Florence. In 2016, the US Bureau of Prisons settled a class-action lawsuit involving 100 mentally ill inmates denied special medication and kept in the dreadful conditions of the prison. The settlement led to some of the most mentally unstable inmates being transferred to special federal facilities, where they finally received psychiatric care. The remaining inmates deemed mentally healthy continue to serve their harsh sentences in solitary cells. As noted earlier, not only solitary cells with complete isolation are present in ADX Florence. Groups of inmates could also be housed following a preliminary assessment to ensure that their joint incarceration would be safe. On April 21, 2005, an extraordinary incident occurred in the prison. Members of a Mexican gang beat another inmate to death. The crime was so brutal that even the nurse, who knew all the inmates' faces, couldn't identify the deceased. Medical staff trying to determine if the man was still alive couldn't do so, as it's impossible to check brain activity through eye response to light when the face is severely disfigured. Fortunately, this incident was the only one in the history of ADX Florence. Today, you learned about probably the strictest prison in the world located in the USA and heard about the terrible conditions in which inmates are held. Thank you for watching.